An enemy soldier saved his life, and the reason isn't what you'd think. That sentence sits heavy in the mouth of the man who said it for the first time, decades after the guns fell silent. He wasn't crediting an act of mercy. He wasn't telling a tale of compassion at the point of a bayonet. What he meant, in the slow, spare way veterans have of folding memory into meaning, was this. A German soldier failed to reach him because his vehicle ran out of fuel. That failure, an absence rather than a deed, is what kept the gun from his chest, what turned the shape of a single life. It sounds almost petty beside the grand histories of armies and strategy, but for that man, and for thousands like him, scarcity did the same work as angels. I promise, this is not a story about courage or chance alone. It's a story about pipes and pumps, convoys and oil drums, about the raw, ugly arithmetic of petroleum. In the winter of 1944, the Ardennes was a place where gasoline mattered more than glory. The reason one enemy soldier didn't reach another person has less to do with morals than with logistics. It is, in a sense, the truth at the core of modern warfare. Whoever controls the fuel can control the battlefield. December 17, 1944. The snow had the same stubborn gray of Europe across Europe, packed and dirty in the roads, brittle on the tree limbs. A German spearhead, driven by a young commander known among his men as Piper, pushed through the Ardennes with a hungry energy that felt in the moment like momentum. They'd been promised a breakthrough. They hoped to seize the Allied forces before the Americans could bring their weight to bear. For a while, luck, daring, and the fog of war seemed to favor them. Then they found Hansfeld. The village was a kind of treasure house, not treasure of jewels or food, but a store of the one thing that makes modern steel and rubber obey orders: fuel. Rows and rows of jerry cans lined up like soldiers themselves, metal glinting under the pale winter light. Pallets of drums stood stacked, the kind of mundane geometry that, to an infantryman, looks like all the power in the world. Men moved among the stacks like children at a fair. Someone brewed coffee over a small stove. The steam rose, heavy with the smell of beans and the sharper tang of gasoline. For men who had been living on scraps and cold bread, the sight of perfectly serviceable fuel was almost obscene, and Army's gasoline sitting unattended. A sergeant named Wilhelm Hoffmann, later a voice historians would point to when reconstructing what happened there, rifled through manifests and found a number that made the men stagger. The captured inventory listed roughly 50,000 gallons of gasoline. That figure meant something real to the company. 50,000 gallons could turn tired trucks back into throbbing convoys. It could refill tanks enough to push farther into enemy lines. To soldiers in that moment, the math was simple and intoxicating.
They celebrated as if they had won a lottery. But to understand why a man claiming an enemy soldier saved my life could be more than sentiment, you have to step back far enough to see scale. Those 50,000 gallons were not a strategic bounty. They were a drop in an ocean. To the Allied logistics machine, fuel was prodigious, almost obscene in its abundance. By 1944, the United States oil and petroleum production had reached numbers that are difficult to visualize, roughly 1.8 billion barrels for the year, an industrial flow that dwarfed Germany's capacity, which was measured in tens of millions of barrels. Germany's total output hovered around the low tens of millions in the same span, roughly 33 million barrels by some counts. The contrast is stark, one side operating with an industrial deluge, the other clogged with scarcity. Numbers like that strip away romantic notions of battle decided by courage alone. Imagine a war where one side's tanks roll with more fuel than sense, and the other's tanks are lucky if they can move at all. The Germans in the Ardennes had some early success because of surprise, because of weather, and because of audacity. But the engine that could have sustained that advance was from the start brittle. On the Allied side, the supply network was a marvel of improvisation and scale. Think of Pluto, the pipeline under the English Channel that pumped fuel from Britain to the continent as a long metallic artery. Think of the Red Ball Express, the convoys of trucks driven by men working around the clock as blood cells ferrying fuel from depots to front lines. The Red Ball wasn't a single truck route, it was a rolling insistence. At its peak, it ran thousands of miles of convoy daily, moving fuel, rations, and ammunition faster than the enemy could count. If you try to picture what those numbers feel like, a simple metaphor helps. The Allies had oceans of fuel. To the Germans, what they captured at Hansfeld felt like finding a cup of water in a desert. 50,000 gallons could feed a hungry Panzer battalion for a while, but when the opposing force can burn through hundreds of thousands of gallons without blinking, when they can afford to destroy supply points to deny them to the enemy, the arithmetic of war shifts. It is worth pausing on that last idea, destruction as power. If the Allies could replace their fuel, and if they preferred burning reserves to letting those reserves fall into German hands, then control over fuel became not only a question of movement, but a weapon in itself. That is what happened at Stavelot. Before we get to the Inferno, think for a moment about the human detail that makes these large forces comprehensible. In their accounts, German soldiers at Hansfeld described the smell of the fuel as almost intoxicating, a high the like of which occurs only to men who know how close they are to need. An American driver, who later recounted being at the depot, remembered seeing serviceable equipment, parked trucks, engines cold but whole, and wondering how quickly they'd be pressed into use. The manuscripts, diaries, and later testimony converge on a small scene. Soldiers who had been surviving were suddenly surrounded by possibility. It is an image that should make you feel the paradox. Abundance, for a time, breeds celebration. For the side that already has abundance, that same sight can be indifferent. A few days earlier, and a few miles away, American engineers had been making a very different decision in the name of strategy. Captain John Brewster, an engineer on the ground, had orders that were brutal in their clarity. Deny fuel to the enemy at all costs. It was not enough to refuse to give it away. The plan was to render it unusable if the Germans got too close. In wartime pragmatism, a perfectly serviceable drum of gasoline that sits idle in an enemy's hands is an active threat. Better, the engineers reasoned, to burn it in a controlled, catastrophic way than to let armored columns find a new lease on life. Stavelot, a name that will keep its echo, was one of the depots chosen for denial. The Americans set up the kind of pyrotechnic choreography that turns logistics into spectacle. White phosphorus grenades were lined with a purpose. They burn with a ferocity that melts metal and consumes petroleum. Technical Sergeant Paul Salas, the man identified again and again in after-action reports as the one who first threw the grenade at Stavelot, stepped forward. The grenade arced and shattered among drums and pallets. To speak plainly, the resulting conflagration was both engineered and grotesque. Fuel-fed flames leapt, and a pillar of black smoke rose until it swallowed the winter sky. The heat made the snow hiss and steam. A sound like 1,000 small explosions rolled across the trees. What the engineers wanted and what they achieved was not merely a bright night. They wanted a message, a denial. By burning millions of gallons in depots like Stavelot, the Allies signaled that they could waste resources rather than give them away. In military calculus, that aptitude, to waste because you can afford to, is itself a kind of weapon. For the Germans watching from an advanced position, the spectacle of Stavelot was disorienting. Piper, who led the spearhead, watched flames and realized something that his maps had not explained. The enemy could afford to destroy its own supplies. In the cold arithmetic of war, that meant one thing. Our capture, even when successful, might do less to recoup their advantage than we'd hoped. A depot razed to cinders is an empty well, no matter how many men stand beside it. You can imagine Piper's men, in the moment of the burning, with conflicting emotions. There was triumph. They'd taken ground. They had secured materiel. There was joy over the stacks at Hansfeld. But there was also a creeping disbelief as they saw whole reserves incinerated rather than captured intact. For frontline soldiers who think in immediate terms of fuel gauges and engine noise, the calculation becomes personal. If the enemy will torch what you found, you cannot easily count on seizing the supply you so desperately need. Which brings us back to the man who said he was saved. He did not mean that a German offered him mercy. He meant that the German campaign, when confronted with an enemy that could burn home supplies without blinking, ran thin. Tanks moved until their gauges read empty. Convoys stopped. Men were forced to withdraw, not always because bullets found them first, but because their mechanized tools could no longer move them forward. A soldier who would have been overrun, who might otherwise have been taken or killed in the chaos of an advance, lived because the enemy's advance stalled. This is not to say the Germans were blameless or that their constraints were purely logistical.
the Malmedy massacre, a war crime that remains one of the darkest stains of the Ardennes campaign, shows how desperation and brutality can combine when supply lines fray and command breaks down. It is a moral anchor we must not lose sight of. When discussing logistics as causality, we must not permit the explanation to become an excuse for atrocity. Atrocities happened, they were crimes. Scarcity does not humanize their perpetrators. Back at Hansfeld, the initial jubilation was tempered by a more global awareness that 50,000 gallons, in the context of Allied industrial throughput, was insufficient to change the strategic odds. The Allied machine had redundancy. Pipes ran underseas, trucks rolled by the hundreds, refineries churned. Take Pluto. The pipeline was a quiet, steady thing. It did not have the romance of convoys or the visible fury of flames, but it had endurance. The Red Ball Express had the violence of motion, the sounds of engines at night, the flash of headlights cutting through snow, and it was human-powered in a way that made it both heroic and expendable. To make the scale feel tangible, imagine this. A single large Allied Army division could burn through tens of thousands of gallons in a day when operating at full throttle. The Red Ball Express, in supply terms, moved the equivalent of an entire town's daily needs by the thousands of tons, day after day. These logistical lines were the spine of the front. When they flexed, the front flexed with them. And the Allies were willing to leverage that abundance ruthlessly. Thus Stavolo and other depots. The decision to incinerate rather than surrender reserves was a measured cruelty aimed at saving lives in the long run. Let me be precise. There is a bitter moral calculus here. Burning millions of gallons meant wrecking infrastructure, creating smoke that choked villages, and complicating medical evacuations.
Civilians paid in the terrible arithmetic of displacement and suffering. But from a strictly military standpoint, destroying fuel that would only accelerate a German advance was, in the commander's view, the lesser evil. What the Germans found over and over in the Ardennes was that momentum costs fuel. You can have surprise and audacity, you can find caches at Hansfeld and cheer, but unless you can keep engines fed, the advantage evaporates. Tanks that could not drink could not run. Trucks without gas became monuments to an aborted offensive. Men who had hoped to seize the day found that on an industrial map their lines were leaking, and the leak could not be plugged by heroics. Imagine now a patrol moving under fog and fir trees. Imagine the sharp clack of a standard-issue radio, the scrape of boots, the distant thump of artillery. The patrol pushes toward what it believes is a breakthrough. Fuel signs are the first miracle they need. Jerry cans, drums, trucks. They find the store at Hansfeld, and for a brief, glittering moment, the future opens. Yet the scenes at Stavolo are not far away in time or space. The glow of an engineered inferno tells a different story. The enemy will burn their own wells. They will deny you the thing you most need. That is a lesson with moral complexity and strategic force. The idea that an enemy soldier might save you by not reaching you is not a story of chivalry. It's a function of this arithmetic. If an armored column runs out of fuel 2 miles from where you stand, it cannot comb the woods for stragglers. It cannot bring its main gun to bear. It cannot move at dawn. That pause, born of scarcity, is a reprieve that stacks into survival. By the time Piper's spearhead pressed deeper into the Ardennes, the contrast between the fuel worlds of the two sides had become clearer. The Germans made gains that for a time seemed decisive, but as they pushed, their lines grew thin and their tanks drank what little fuel they had quickly. The Allies, even when they burned supplies to deny the enemy, still had a reservoir of replacement, a continuous, usually invisible supply system that could be rerouted, replenished, and kept moving. If the Germans could not guarantee fuel, then every kilometer gained became harder to hold. We come to a quiet, terrible irony. When supply is a weapon, waste can be strategy. The Americans set fire to their own depots, not from cowardice, but from calculation. They preferred to watch flames devour millions of gallons, rather than hand the equivalent of a second wind to the Germans. To see the ash and the smoke and know your side can make that sacrifice, that is a kind of dominance. The men who stood at Hansfeld could feel that the field of battle was changing, although not every private could name the pipelines or the exact figure for annual production. They saw an image, fuel either in their hands or burning up into the sky. They made their choices according to the moment's logic.
Sergeant Hoffman, poring over manifests, became one of the small historians of that morning. His notes would later be used by those reconstructing the campaign, numbers that bind small human euphoria to a larger strategic body. And yet, even as the scales tip toward logistics, the human stories continue to matter. A private squatting by a jerrycan thinks of home. A panzer crew checks its cold engine and prays the fuel gauge reads fuller than last night. A medic counts stretchers and curses the loss of ambulances that could not be refueled. These faces hold the practical weight of strategies. When a tank stops because its gauge says 0, it is not an abstraction. It is a living, breathing cessation of threat. So why does the claim an enemy soldier saved his life feel both right and unsatisfactory? It is right because of what a stalled tank means in a tactical sense. An empty tank cannot overrun a foxhole. It is unsatisfactory because it imputes intention where there was none. The German soldier who never reached him didn't intend benevolence, he intended to fight. His inability to reach was a byproduct of supply failedness and Allied denial. When a veteran looks back and speaks of a German that saved him, he's translating a complex series of logistical moves into a human scale he can live with. The next move in this story is the pivot. After Hansfeld and after Stavelot, after the black smoke clears and the math of barrels is written into the margins of daily operations, the offensive begins to slow. Men begin to report abandoned tanks, engines still warm but empty. Convoys falter. The fighting changes from a bold advance into an exhausted gritting of teeth. For the Allied soldier who later said he owed his life to an enemy soldier's failure, this is the critical moment, the pivot where machinery ran out of motion and men breathed. There is a practical point to lock onto here. When a commander orders the burning of a depot, he accepts short-term damage to infrastructure and civilian life for a longer-term strategic gain. That choice carries moral consequences that must be acknowledged. Civilians who live near the depot, wounded soldiers who rely on fuel for evacuation, and the broader environment all bear the cost. But on the ledger of war's immediate aims, to stop an enemy's advance, the sacrifice often produced the intended effect: denial of mobility. As the flames licked Stavelot, Piper watched and understood that his spearhead now faced not just the opposition of guns, but the opposition of industry. The ability of the Americans to waste their own fuel without collapsing their capacity to fight was itself an operational advantage. Once that realization lodged in command, the tactics available to the Germans shrank. Not every commander had to be an economic historian to see that his tanks were subject to numbers he could not change on the spot.
And yet, for the man in the foxhole, the one whose story opens this account, the calculus is beautifully simple. He woke that morning with the same terrors and hopes as before. At some point, a party of Germans came near, but they did not root him out. They advanced, then stalled. He does not say that some single enemy extended mercy. He says instead that the enemy could not reach him because its tanks were empty. That simple sentence carries within it the entire cloud of decisions: pipelines that flowed unseen, trucks that kept the front alive, engineers who chose to burn, commanders who weighed sacrifice against gain. The man reduced all that to a human phrase: an enemy soldier saved my life. There is a certain irony in that reduction. It compresses industrial complexity into a human scale that memory can hold. It is interpretive, not forensic. It is the kind of truth that sits inside testimony rather than inside a supply manifest. And yet, if you move from the intimate to the structural, you see how accurate that testimony can be. A stalled tank is a stalled threat. A stalled threat means someone is not shot, not captured, not killed. The chain of causation runs from barrels to engines to lives. We pause here because the story has more pivots to make. The burning at Stavelot did not by itself end the Ardennes offensive. It set a tone. It was one of a cluster of denials, of convoys harried and refused, of supply notes sacrificed to keep larger movements at bay. The sparks that rose over Stavelot were an emblem of a choice, and choices ripple. In the next stretch of the story, we will follow those ripples into abandoned tanks, into shifts in morale, into the painful arithmetic of medical evacuations, and into the decisions made by men like Piper when the map stops making sense. But for the moment, hold the image. Men crouched among neat rows of jerry cans in Hansfeld, the scent of coffee and gasoline mixing in a cold sun, and somewhere not far off the sky blackened with smoke as Stavelot burned by design. In between those two images sits a hinge, the hinge of logistics, and on that hinge the fate of many turned.
For one private, for one veteran who would say later that an enemy soldier saved his life, that hinge moved in such a way that survival happened not because of a single act of mercy, but because of 100 acts of supply and denial, all grinding together into a force more decisive than valor alone. If this sounds like a sterile interpretation of what happened on a battlefield, a story about barrels and pipelines rather than men, remember this: the pipes and barrels were run by men. They were the choices made in the calculus of command and the sweat of mechanics and drivers. When they decided to burn Stivalo, somebody had to light the grenade. When the Red Ball Express ran through nights of snow, somebody had to drive those miles. The human and the industrial were braided.
The irony remains: an enemy soldier's failure to arrive can be traced to thousands of human efforts on both sides, and in that tracing, we find a truth that is both practical and moral. Here is the point that will carry us into the next phase of the account. The burning at Stivalo and the capture at Hansfeld are not isolated curiosities. They are signals. They reveal the shape of a war fought as much by smokestacks and pipelines as by rifle and bayonet. They explain why tanks stopped where they did, why bridges remained uncrossed, and why, in one man's memory, a German soldier's absence felt emphatically like salvation. If you find yourself wondering at this point whether the whole account has become a lecture on pumps and inventory rather than a human story, you are right to feel that tension. The machines and routes are the skeleton of this tale. The men are the flesh. And in the days after Hansfeld and Stivalo, the interplay between them produced scenes that read like a catalog of war's small cruelties and rare mercies. If this story is gripping you and you want more deep, surprising histories like this one, subscribe. We'll keep unpacking the moments that change a war. The first clear consequence of the burn and deny policy showed up as abandoned metal. Reports from the field begin to pile up with the same little inventory of loss. Tanks beached with engines still warm, half-full fuel drums kicked open and drained into the snow, trucks left in neat rows, hoods up, crews gathered in small, exhausted knots. A patrol would push around a bend and find in eerie silence the litter of a stopped advance, a turret staring at nothing, a knocked-out half-track whose crew had simply walked away. Captain James Rose, a tank battalion officer whose resupply diary is cited in after-action accounts, logged the practical measures of these days: rerouted fuel, desperate siphoning between vehicles, orders to conserve what little remained. Those orders are not romance, they are arithmetic. A commander cannot spin steel if there is no liquid in the tank. When an order goes out to restrict movements, the map becomes a cage. You can almost read the supply map like a human pulse. Where the arteries thin, the tissues, meaning frontline units, go pale. Colonel James Snyder, who worked at the logistics level for the 1st Army, later pieced together how those arteries had run. In staff meetings, he could show on a table the difference between a unit's ideal consumption and the reality on the road. The gap is where strategy dies. The Allied stores could refill, reroute, and endure. German supplies could not be magically regenerated, and each mile they gained demanded more fuel than their fragile logistics could support. When the German command discovered that captured depots were not a dependable source because the Americans would burn them rather than let them fall intact, the mathematical bedrock of the offensive began to crumble. That math manifested itself in a variety of human ways. Ambulances that needed to evacuate wounded could not be sent if fuel was scarce. Field hospitals found themselves improvising with what they had. Medics carried litters farther because trucks could not be trusted. There are recorded instances where an evacuation hoped for in the evening had to be delayed until convoy capacity returned, and some wounded died because the fuel to move them never arrived. This is not a flourish, it is an ugly ledger item that names the human toll of a logistical equation. At the same time, stories of narrow survivals circulated among the men. One of those stories belongs to a private who later in life would be known in his town as someone who had nearly been taken in the Ardennes. He told a reporter, and this is how memory tends to work, folding complex cause into a single telling image, that the Germans had come close, that he could hear the engines, and that then, for reasons that seemed at the time almost miraculous, they stopped. He said simply, "We thought they stopped because of tactics." Later, historians and witnesses would supply a more structural explanation. They stopped because their tanks ran out of fuel.
It is important to treat such recollections with care. Memory translates chain reactions into simple sentences that can be spoken and carried home. That private's claim that an enemy soldier saved my life is, in the best interpretive sense, accurate, not because a German raised a hand in mercy, but because the logistic reality of empty gauges removed the immediate threat. His statement is a way of narrating complexity into testimony that a life can bear. There is a darker side to that same calculus. When the supply line shrank and behavior hardened, brutality sometimes followed. The Malmedy massacre, properly named and recorded as a war crime, stands as a grim reminder that when command structures fray and frustration bursts into violence, civilians and prisoners become victims. Mentioning Malmedy is not a digression, it is an ethical necessity. It insists that while we analyze barrels and pipelines, we do not whitewash or rationalize the atrocities that occurred in the fog of failing logistics and escalating desperation. Scarcity does not excuse cruelty, it sometimes fuels it. The psychological effect on German troops watching the Allies burn depots was profound. Men like Piper saw not just the loss of fuel, but the demonstration of strategic breadth, that an opponent could willfully destroy its reserves and still continue fighting. Imagine the mood that would cultivate in a force already pushed to the margins. Anger, bewilderment, a dawning sense of being out-resourced. If an army believes it can take what it finds and convert it into the momentum needed to hold gains, that belief is a practical engine.
When that belief is shown to be illusory, when depots become pyres rather than prizes, momentum loses its fuel in both the literal and figurative sense. One day, a German crew abandoned a panzer in a stand of trees and left the driver's hatch open. The snow around it was smeared with tracks, and oddly, with the residue of a hastily drained fuel drum. A U.S. infantryman described in a post-war interview stepping into the vehicle to find the instruments cold and the tank's radio silent. These small, quiet moments are not the dramatic tableau of battlefield heroism. They are the everyday material of a campaign running out of feedstock. You can measure the campaign's decline in the rustings and the cold hoods and the stopped clocks on dashboards. Back at the supply end, the Red Ball Express kept running, a human tide of trucks and drivers who worked shifts that ate the night. The drivers came from varied backgrounds and bore the strain physically and mentally. They had to cross shell tracks, avoid traffic, and keep engines alive through cold that attacked batteries and sagged hoses. The Red Ball did more than move fuel, it moved hope. It became for many an emblem of what it meant to be able to outsupply an adversary, a practical manifestation of the industrial advantage. But alliances of movement and denial meant that sometimes the resource was there and sometimes not. The American commanders who had to decide whether to incinerate their own depots did so with a calculus that would be harsh to judge from the moral distance of peace. Burning Stivalo was not simply a military order, it was a decision that assumed a terrible premise, that short-term destruction would save more lives than it cost. The smoke that climbed into the December sky carried with it that moral freight. Villagers remembered the night as something between a pyre and a thunderstorm. The noise was unkind. Animals fled. Cottages downwind filled with soot. Yet the commanders who authorized the denial argued in staff rooms and at maps to allow intact fuel to pass into the hands of an offensive force would allow an immediate multiplication of enemy effect. We need to resist the temptation to frame such choices as purely cold calculation with no human feeling. The engineers and sergeants who arranged the grenades at Stivalo were not cartoon villains. They were people weighing an ugly set of options with limited information and compressed time. That does not absolve them morally, it merely complicates our judgment. War places agency inside terrible constraints. When people light white phosphorus to make a point at the scale of strategy, their hands and faces are still human, and so are the faces of those who will live or die because of the flame. Piper's reaction to the burning depots is telling in a way that asks no sympathy. He was a commander carrying the weight of orders and expectation. When he watched the page-like fire at Stivalo, he perceived a fact. The opponent had resources so deep it could burn to deny. His subsequent operations demonstrated how that perception matters. If you suspect the enemy can always choose to set fire to what you might capture, your appetite for risk shifts. You stop planning to feed on prizes found in a village square. You start to plan for the long haul, and the long haul requires supply that, for the Germans, was increasingly hypothetical. There are intimate vignettes that illustrate how the lack of fuel translated into lives. One sergeant, let us call him Roy Anderson, using the name the veteran himself used in testimony, spoke often in later years about a night when he and his men huddled in a farm basement as engines thumped in the distance. They thought the noise meant they were about to be overrun. Instead, as a strange hush settled and the thumping receded, they realized that the noise had been engines running out of juice. In Roy's telling, decades later, he said simply, "The Germans didn't make it that night." That was the sentence that would become a private truth he carried the rest of his life. If one wanted to be forensic about causality, one would trace every link, from refineries to convoys, from orders in a staff tent to the man who released a grenade, and point to the chain. That is what historians like Hoffman do in their careful reconstructions. Hoffman's manifests, those scrawled sheets showing inventory at Hansfield, tie a local jubilation to a global imbalance. The numbers show the smallness of what was captured against the backdrop of production capacity. The manifest gives a shape to the lucky find, but the manifest cannot, on its own, produce the private conviction of someone who woke up alive because an enemy firing line failed to reach him. Memory stitches the ledger to the human, and the human stitches memory to meaning. The larger military implication of these scenes is blunt. Mechanized warfare is consumption writ in steel. Every additional mile an army intends to travel requires a corresponding volume of fuel. You cannot surprise and then sustain unless you have the materials to keep engines turning. The Germans' plan in the Ardennes assumed, perhaps optimistically, that sudden advantage would be supplyable from captured depots and local railheads. The Allies counterstructured that assumption by making sure captured materials were not reliably helpful. They could destroy and absorb that destruction. They could shift routes and make up the deficit. In that flexibility, they held an advantage that outlived any single tactical success the Germans could manage. There is an irony here that deserves its own line. One way to beat a force is to make them run out of the very things that allow them to move and think. To win by denying mobility is an old idea. To do it at the scale of oil, pipelines, and convoys is the modern adaptation. The American capacity to throw away fuel that the enemy might use is not merely waste, it is a strategic statement. It says, we can afford scarcity if that scarcity blocks you. And what of the men on the receiving end? For the private in the foxhole, the arithmetic comes down to a single blessed fact. The enemy stopped. There is no honor in the way that stoppage came about, whether from meticulous logistics planning, the generosity of a production economy, or the calculated cruelty of burning one's own reserves. The private's life is not a thesis, it is a pulse. If an enemy soldier, by virtue of being unable to reach, left him alive, the veteran is entitled to call that a kind of salvation. He turns systemic causality into a human sentence, because that is how a life can carry it home. To close the loop, let us return to images that are simple to hold. A pile of jerry cans at Hansfield gleaming under hard sun, a field of smoke at Stavolo where flames eat whatever they can, a highway of trucks and a convoy moving through night like a metronome of sustainment, and a foxhole where a man later says a German saved him. When you line these images up, you get a clear narrative. The captured fuel was not enough to buy victory. The burned fuel was enough to deny momentum. The convoys and pipelines were enough to keep the Allied machine running, and the gap between needing fuel and having it shaped battles and lives. There is also a moral seam running through the tale. The decision to destroy rather than surrender can be couched as strategy, and it is, but it also imposes suffering in the present on civilians and on the wounded. War forces choices that will always have victims. A commander who chooses denial over capture is making a complex moral trade. Part of this story's ache comes from resting inside that trade. The Allies burned to prevent greater bloodshed on a broader scale. The immediate costs were visible and real. The lesson is not simple, and for the men and women caught nearby, the calculus offered cold comfort. In the months that followed the Ardennes offensive, historians and veterans alike would return to Hansfield and Stavolo to try to make sense of particulars. Some would focus on the audacity of the German push, others on the brilliance of Allied logistics. Many would find their own private truth in a single moment. For one veteran in particular, the one who told the simple sentence that begins this film, the truth was, an enemy soldier failed to arrive because the machine that should have carried him had no fuel. That failure was an absence that saved life. It is a way of saying that victory and survival in this era come as much from pipes and production lines as from bullets.
To summarize, without recourse to Dramadilla, in the Ardennes, the decisive factors were not only leadership or bravery, but the ability to feed movement. The Allies could subsidize waste in a way the Germans could not.
That asymmetry allowed the Allies to choose denial with a kind of detached ruthlessness that functioned as a defensive weapon. The Germans could seize caches, but not sustain the advance. The captured 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld was psychologically enormous for a group of hungry troops, but strategically puny in the face of the Allied petroleum juggernaut. So when a veteran, years later, says an enemy soldier saved my life, what he is doing is translating the cold mechanics of logistics into the language of human gratitude and gratitude's reverse, surprise that something so mechanical could enact mercy. The soldier did not intend to save him, the equipment failed, or strategy denied, and the result was the same. That is the odd, humbling truth of industrial war. Tools and numbers can shelter a person as surely as a comrade's hand. We end where we began, not with a neat moral, but with an observation that feels both obvious and underappreciated. Wars of steel are also wars of supply. The pipelines, the convoys, the decisions to burn or not to burn, these are the hidden actors that determine where lives are spared and where they are lost. The scene at Hansfeld and the flame at Stavolo are emblematic of a larger fact. Abundance, when organized, is a weapon as decisive as any battalion. For the private who lived to tell the story, the absence of an enemy soldier was a presence in his life long after the guns fell silent. If you've been struck by the way logistics can flip the script of battle, tell us below which moment surprised you more, the seized stores at Hansfeld or the deliberate inferno at Stavolo. And if you want more deep dives into the unexpected forces that shape history, subscribe and join us. There are more stories like this, where the surprising actors are pipes, trucks, and choices that burned through the night.